Today we're going to be talking about personality and the environment. And when you guys ended class, you did this song exercise, right, where each of you wrote down your list of favorite songs and then passed it to your neighbor, and they made some judgments about that list of songs. So I want to read a few examples. This was one of them. Kanye West, Get 'Em High, The Roots, Seed 2.0, Chris Brown, Yo, Ice Cube, Today Was a Very Good Day. And the person said that from the list of songs, I can infer that this person is laid back and does not follow mainstream trends due to some of the old school and underground songs. So that was the appraisal on that one. Another list was Above and Beyond, Sun and Moon, Drake, Take Care, Usher, Climax, Katy Perry, Teenage Dream, and Goo Goo Dolls, Iris. And the neighbor of this person said they like upbeat songs, but also ones with a kind of melodic and catchy rhythm and beat. I've never heard the first song, but it sounds great. Like songs with a lot of meaning and soul behind them. Person enjoys life and everything about it. So you guys are making some interesting judgments about the song list. And then another list was Audio Machine. Forgot the name of that one. Two Steps, Freedom Fighter, Bach, Opus 32, Concerto for Two Violins, Nearer My God to Thee, and The Killers. And what this person said is, I can't really say much because I'm not familiar with these songs, but by the names of the songs and bands, I feel like this person is the type who likes listening to their music with their big headphones in their room on full blast. He also seems like someone who plays an instrument and likes to rock out. Okay. So these are some of the examples that you all turned in. And we're going to be talking today how people use their environments to make cues or to make judgments about other people's personality, their interests. And also you can do that when you walk into somebody's room and you see what they put up on the wall. So there are a lot of ways in which we use environmental cues to make inferences about other people. So when looking at the relationship between environment and personality, one of the issues has to do with how your personality traits are influenced, how they influence your interpretation of your environment. So if you're a stimulation seeker, for example, you're going to find certain environments maybe too boring or not interesting and exciting enough. If you're a low stimulation seeker, you might have just the opposite kind of judgment. Also, places have personalities, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. They have their own sort of climate, atmosphere, and they help shape our own personalities. So depending on where you grew up or whether you went to a big high school or a small high school, all of those kinds of influences have an influence on your own characteristics. So when we talk about personality, we're usually referring to a relatively stable set of personal characteristics, the ways in which an individual perceives things or their behavioral tendencies. And these tendencies are observable by others across a variety of situations and settings. So that's generally what psychologists mean when they talk about personality. But until the field of environmental psychology got going, there wasn't much interest in how the large-scale environment really helped to shape personality. It was more about sort of the immediate family, the microenvironment of the home, parents' personalities as they influenced their kids' personalities, but not too much about the kinds of environments where people were spending their time. So these are really four basic relationships between the large-scale environment and personality. First off, the environment reveals personality. So your room decorations, your musical selections, your web page content. People use these as cues to make judgments about your own personal qualities. Secondly, the environment shapes personality. So we saw in the behavior settings research of Barker that depending on the staffing level of a school system, if it was understaffed, it put a lot of pressure on those students to take on more roles, leadership roles. And yet if that setting was overstaffed, you had more peripheral people that couldn't get as involved in leadership positions. So the environment has a definite influence on the development of our personality. If you grow up in a place where you can meet a lot of people, and we remember that study by Festinger, Schachter, and Bach at MIT, where proximity to other people spatially, in terms of where they lived in that apartment complex, predicted friendship patterns. In some communities, you don't have as many opportunities to meet other people. So the structure of the environment can influence personality that way. Now, the third pathway is that the kind of personalities we develop have an influence on what we do in the environment and our health. There's a lot of research on personality and health, and many of these personality traits have to do with environmental preferences. So if you like really exciting, risky environments, that's one kind of personality orientation. The coronary-prone behavior pattern means that you tend to be very job-involved, and you tend to drive yourself really hard, and you go from one environment to the other trying to do as much as you can. And that leads to certain kind of behavioral patterns. And the final pathway here is that personality is sometimes in the middle between the environment we're exposed to and then the outcomes of that exposure. So if you take a group of people and you expose them to a really chaotic, stressful environment, if they're high sensation seekers in that group, they're going to be more resistant to feeling the effects of that stress because they have a higher tolerance for stimulation and overload. And if some of the people in that group are low stimulation seekers, they're going to be much more put off by too much stimulation. So the personality that people have can mediate the relationship between the environment and the effects it has on their health and behavior. So these are the four kind of pathways we want to talk about in terms of how the large-scale environment affects people's personality. Now, we'll start off with how the environment reveals personality. And these are a lot of examples up here of walking into somebody's dorm room, for example. And here you've got a kind of chaotic look. Here you've got a very neat and organized look. You walk into this conference room and you see a lot of emphasis on the employees' pictures and their achievements, their awards. Some conference rooms don't do that in a work environment. So when you go into these environments, they have a subtle influence on how you make inferences about the people that work there, live there, occupy that space. Now we're going to play a little vignette here, and I want you to think about how the people in this situation are making inferences about another person's personality based on the situation, the environmental situation.
Nick. Yeah. What is that? Hey, Jojo! Hey.
All right, thanks for the ride, Kramer.
No, thank you. So what are you doing? Nothing. Come on, let's go to the beach. Are you crazy? No, it's a beautiful day. Have a good time.
Yeah, there's something in the air today. You feel it? There's something in the air.
You know you're turning into Burt Lancaster?
Yeah, there's something in the air.
Oh, I forgot to call Jill. Jill, hi, it's Elaine. How is your father? Is everything okay? What? I can't hear you so good. There's a lot of static. What? I'm going to call you back.
Jill's father is in the hospital and you call to ask about him on a cell phone?
What, no good?
Faux pas.
Faux pas?
Big, hefty, stinking faux pas.
Right. You can't make a health inquiry on a cell phone. It's like saying I don't want to take up any of my important time at my home, so I'll just get it out of the way on the street.
And the street cell phone call is the lowest phone call you can make.
It's an act of total disregard. It's selfish.
It's dismissive.
It's pompous.
Why don't you think before you do something?
Here's a thought. Bye-bye.
If you were in that situation, what kind of inferences would you make about Elaine, or what do you think they were concluding about Elaine based on her cell phone call? Yeah. Leslie? Is it Leslie? Yeah. Okay, so Leslie's saying that maybe they're inferring that she's kind of selfish, superficial. She's sort of getting the call out of the way while she's walking down the street where she can't really focus in on what her friend might say about her father's condition. Yeah. That's a very interesting observation. Aisha's saying that because this is in an urban situation, and we saw that study by Stanley Milgram on how urban dwellers react to stimulation overload. What do? They screen out outputs. They don't devote as much time to each interaction. So maybe you take kind of what she did with a grain of salt, that, okay, she's an urbanite and she's got a lot going on in terms of what she's managing in that situation, and you don't attribute so much to her personally, but rather she's in she's living in a city where she's got to manage all that overload. Other thoughts about how they were judging or might judge that situation? Yeah, what's your name? Anita. That's a great observation. Anita's saying that because our use of technology has evolved, our norms about technology have evolved, and they've changed. So nowadays, people are texting on the run, they're calling on the run. It's normative. You know, you don't sort of put somebody down and assume that they're a bad person or they're not a very considerate person just because they're making a cell phone call like that. So in a sense, that episode might be a little dated now, right, because of how we've embraced technology. So, and everything is about speed today, you know. So we're going to Web 2.0 and we're going to the 4G system of cell phones, and it's more and more speed. So how can you fault somebody if they're sort of buying into that? So it's an interesting example of how people make these links between behavior in a particular environmental context and why that would be sort of information for what their personality is like. Any other thoughts about kind of what's going on in that particular video? Eleanor is saying that you could maybe infer that Elaine's sort of a disorganized person because she gets out of that car when, Kramer slams on the brakes and she's thinking about other things, and then she remembered she should have called her friend. So, maybe she's a little bit absent-minded or not that organized. So, yeah, those are all really interesting comments and observations. What's your name? David. Yeah, so the guy walks down the street saying hello to Jerry and George, and they don't even acknowledge him, right? And then they're putting her down because they're saying that she's being kind of superficial. So that's a little bit of an irony in that situation as well. So when we look at that Gosling paper that is listed for Tuesday, actually, we're going to talk about it today, it's a fairly involved, little bit of a jargony article. There's a lot of terminology there. So we want to break some of that down. And it's a simple idea that if you're an observer of someone like Elaine making a cell phone call on the street, or you walk into somebody's room and you see that they have a very organized desk, or that they have a lot of books, or whatever these cues are, you're using those cues as a kind of lens to try to view and understand what their underlying quality is like. Are they conscientious or not conscientious? Are they sociable or not? So you're utilizing cues here based on what you observe in the environment. And then whether those cues are a good predictor of the underlying personality trait, that has to do with the validity of the cue. So if you think that having an organized desk really, in fact, does predict this person's conscientiousness, that would be high cue validity. And so when people are good at using the cues and making these valid inferences, that's called functional achievement or accuracy. So you're making accurate judgments as an observer in that particular situation. So that's called the lens model of how observers make judgments about room occupants. In the Gosling paper, they talk about a number of different types of cues in a physical environment. So one of those categories is self-directed identity claims. And you can think about your own environments in terms of what you put on the wall. And they're saying that often you're using these kind of postings, these personalizations of your room, to sort of reinforce, for your own benefit, what you're like, your own view of yourself. So that's called a self-directed identity claim. Another directed identity claim is for the benefit of others. So here in this apartment near our campus, this particular person decided to do all of this sort of wall art in their living room, which you typically don't see when you walk into somebody's living room, right, through the front door. Maybe you'd see something like that in their bedroom. But this is a pretty out there kind of statement about, what they want others to see them as. So it's a symbolic statement made by a person to others through physical displays about how they'd like to be regarded. And what might you conclude about that kind of artwork, somebody, drawing that on the wall? Unconventional. So that's another kind of trait you could infer from that behavior and that residue, that cue. Any other inferences you might make? What's your name? What Jacqueline's saying is that this becomes a kind of focus when somebody walks in, and it's a conversation breaker or starter, and it opens up interaction. So maybe the people that live in this place are more about interactions than sort of passive TV viewing or something like that. So that's an interesting kind of way to view it. Now, sometimes people make false identity claims. Okay, what's a false identity claim? Why would you want to do that? Okay, so you want to dress up your qualities and make them more appealing so that people like you better. And some would say, well, people do that on Facebook and social networking, although the study we read earlier suggested that people's Facebook pages are really pretty accurate depictions of what they're really like. So we're going to run a little, another video clip here to illustrate this notion of a false identity claim. And this happens sometimes in environments, or it might happen on a web page. It might happen in a dorm that you've seen, or, yeah. What's your name? Amanda.
It's not necessarily a dorm, but I have a friend who she actually grew up here on the West Coast. But she spent quite a bit of time in New York, kind of living there at times. And she finds that when she goes to Europe, people like her better when she says she's from New York. they just kind of respond a little more favorably to her. Or even San Francisco, if she mentions San Francisco. But if she just says Southern California, it's kind of not as... So she kind of plays up that a little bit more.
Interesting. All right, good. So these are some of the categories that Gosling and his colleagues talk about in terms of how people present themselves, these identity claims, true or false, personal, self, or other directed. Now there's some other categories that they look at as well. One is this interior behavioral residue, which is a fancy way of saying that this guy has a guitar in his room, so you can kind of infer that he probably plays a guitar in his room. And he's got a lot of books, and so maybe he's sort of studious. So these are traces of activities that are actually conducted by somebody in their immediate environment. So you walk in, and those would be interior behavioral residues or cues. This category is exterior behavioral cues or residues, and these are physical traces of activities performed by people outside their immediate surroundings. So if you walk in and you see that somebody has a snowboard or skis or something like that, obviously they're not doing that in Verano or some other place around here. So it's an exterior behavioral cue. It allows you to sort of infer something about their hobbies or their interests that happen away from the immediate environment. So these are four categories that they're putting together. Before we sort of put up their model, I just want to read a quote from John Steinbeck that they mentioned in their article in Travels with Charlie. And Steinbeck in that novel said, "An animal resting or passing leaves crushed grass, footprints, and perhaps droppings. But a human occupying a room for a night prints his character, his biography, his recent history, and sometimes his future plans and hopes. I further believe that personality seeps into the walls and it is slowly released. As I sat in this unmade room, Lonesome Harry began to take shape and dimension. I could feel that recently departed guest in the bits and pieces of himself that he had left behind." So this is the idea that our physical environments take on our character to some extent, either because we're intentionally putting things up that we want to influence our own views of ourselves or other people's views of us. Sometimes they can be physical traces that we leave behind that we didn't really intend anybody to see, like some laundry receipts or an empty bottle of whiskey or something like that. But you can use those kind of cues to judge what the person might be like. And by the same token, just as people leave their imprint on their environments, our environments leave a major imprint on us and our personality as we go through our lives and we go from one setting to another. So this is the kind of complex model. Looks complex, although it's a pretty simple idea. It's the idea that when you go into an observation situation and you see these cues, these residues, so this is a self-directed identity claim. Somebody puts out a pebble that they collected from a favorite beach, or an other directed identity claim. They put an I voted sticker up in their room, or an interior behavioral residue. They have a very organized workspace, or an external behavioral residue. There's a snowboard in the room. So the observer takes a look at these residues, these cues, and starts to make inferences about that person's behavior. They collect memorabilia, they vote, they organize their belongings, they go snowboarding. And from those behaviors, they then start to make inferences about the underlying traits. They're sentimental, because they collect these kind of memorabilia. They're socially responsible because they voted. They're conscientious, given the neatness of their workspace. And they're sensation seekers because they like to snowboard or maybe they like to parachute or something like that. So observers are going through these steps of taking the cues, the physical cues in the room, and they're inferring the behaviors, and then from the behaviors inferring the traits that underlie the behaviors. So this is the sort of theoretical summary of how Gosling, how their research suggests that people make these personality judgments based on others' environments. Now, just as the environment reveals our personality, it can have a major impact on the characteristics that we develop. So these are two studies we've already talked about. Festinger-Schachter-Bach, the linear distance between front doors predicted friendship patterns, political attitudes, and sociability to the extent that people lived near a lot of people and they made a lot of friends. In this study by Barker on behavior settings, as you look at the larger high schools, and these high schools are by categories of size, the participations of students, participations per 1,000 students in extracurricular behavior settings, whether it's a team or it's a newspaper or cheerleading or something, those are much higher in the smaller schools and they drop off precipitously in the larger schools. So what that's saying, as we mentioned before, is that the size of the school, the overstaffing of the setting is having quite an influence on the person's tendency to get involved in leadership roles and take on more and more responsibility. Maybe they become more extroverted, more sociable. So think about the kinds of environments that you grow up in and what kind of influences they might have had on you, whether it's a high school or a faith-based group or something like that. They have tremendous influences on our personality. Now, one way of looking at this influence of physical environments on our personality is the concept of place identity. And this is something that environmental psychologist Harold Pershansky and his colleagues have done research on. And this refers to those facets of a person's identity that reflect his or her psychological attachment to a particular place. So if you grew up in a hometown that you really miss or you really feel part of, that's part of your self-identity. It's that place identity part of your personal characteristics. And this might include visual imagery, memories, symbolic meanings of a place that become part of your self-concept and personality. So an example of that for me these are some of the behavior settings where I grew up. So this is my childhood home. Interestingly, when I lived there, it used to have pink walls for some reason. That seemed to be in color at the time, not so much today. But this is a picture that my son took when he went back to Miami for a conference, and he visited this place, and he sent me a picture of it for old time's sake. So I spent a lot of years there. This is my elementary school, Coralwell Elementary School in Miami. This is the Miami Orange Bowl before they built Joe Robbie Stadium for the Dolphins. And my dad and my dad would get off of work on Friday night, and we would always go to the University of Miami football games. That was sort of one of the things we did together. So that has a lot of nice memories for me. We later moved to a different part of the city, and this is my high school, Palmetto High School in Florida. This is Biscayne Boulevard in Miami, so I spent many a day driving up and down that route. And just recently, this week, I was in Chicago for a conference, and I went back and visited some of my old haunts there. These pictures are actually from an earlier visit, but this is the quadrangles at the University of Chicago, the skyline of Chicago on Michigan Avenue, and then the library at the University of Chicago, which I really kind of liked hanging out there. It's a beautiful room. And, I have a lot of memories from college in terms of things I did in that city and in those places. So you can think for yourselves in terms of where you've grown up, what places you've been involved in, and those memories you have are part of the environmental cognition that Dr. Misra talked about on Tuesday. They stick with you. They become part of your identity, whether it's remembering things you used to do with your parent or remembering the 6 years that you spent in that elementary school. And then, of course, I went off to grad school at the University of North Carolina. This is the South Hall there, the main administrative building. Very different kind of environment, southern college town as compared to this sprawling city of Chicago. And social ecology, where I've spent a lot of years after coming from grad school. And one of the things I thought about as I walked around Chicago near my hotel this time is there was the Allerton Hotel, and I remember bringing my older son when he was 13 to a conference with me because he was a huge fan of the Chicago Cubs, and he really wanted to go to this conference because it was in Chicago, and maybe we'd get to go to Wrigley Field and he could check it out. And so I spent a lot of time with him at that conference walking around looking for Chicago Cubs paraphernalia and trying to get over to Wrigley Field. But whenever I go back to Chicago and I walk by Gino's Pizza or I walk by that hotel, I think of, events I had with my kids when I was in Chicago, and it really made an impact on them. They still remember some of those events as well. So we all have this whole constellation of memories and place experiences that become part of us. And it's in that sense that places leave their impact on us. And some places don't leave a very fun or positive, very desirable impact on us. Some places are pretty stressful, and we just as soon forget about them. So it's not always places that are influencing us in a real positive way. So places can reveal our personality. They can influence the development of our personality through place identity and memories. And then places themselves have a kind of personality. Sometimes that's called ambiance, or the overall feel or atmosphere of a place. So you can go into this Plaza Mayor in Madrid, Spain, and it's such a beautifully designed, scaled environment for pedestrians that people just love to sit there and sort of take it in. It's aesthetically really pleasing. It's very sociable. So we also talk about the social climate of a place. You go to Ghirardelli Square, and you see people taking pictures of each other. Even though there are a lot of strangers around, they're doing things as if they feel comfortable there. They don't mind that there's strangers watching them do that because it's just a very kind of friendly, sociable place. And you can think of some urban environments that aren't that way, that would be opposite of that. Can any of you think of an urban environment that would be quite different than Ghirardelli Square? How many of you have been to Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco? So what might be a kind of opposite reaction to another type of place where it wouldn't be so sociable? The ambiance would be different. A library? Okay. No, that's great. Amber's saying that downtown LA, because it's got these monolithic high-rise buildings, the scale for pedestrians is off. It's not very comfortable. And later when we talk about urban design in the second part of the class, we'll see this concept of human scale. How do you design an environment that's scaled to be comfortable for people walking through it, not just people speeding through it on an expressway, but actually walking or biking through it. So those are some places that might have a different feel than Ghirardelli Square. And, you can think of other kinds of identities of environments. There are some environments that have a very strong musical landscape or signature. Can you think of any cities that have a particular musical signature to them or identity? Yeah, Aisha. New Orleans, Dixieland Jazz. Other examples? Yeah, what's your name? Jeff? Okay, Memphis, Nashville. What would you say about Memphis and Nashville? Yeah, country rock. Nashville, Ryman Hall. We'll show a video of a Neil Young concert in Ryman Hall in Nashville. And it's drenched with memories and tradition. So it has a distinctive atmosphere or ambiance to Nashville. Any other examples? Yeah, Amber. Vienna. What about Vienna? Classical music. Okay, so a lot of the Baroque composers were working in Vienna. So you can think of these different cities. Maybe you can think of the rock scene in Seattle when Jimi Hendrix was starting out there. But many of our cities have that strong, very strong kind of identity because of music. And that's why we emphasize music a lot in this class, because it's part of our environment that conveys our attachment to places, how we feel about places, and how our personalities are shaped by the places we grow up. That song or that tape we played as you were coming in, that John Lennon wrote, In My Life. What's the song In My Life about? Anybody know? But also, I think that song that's a good point, but I think the song is also saying that the relationships you have are so colored by the places in which you were involved with people. And so that song was written by Lennon as he rode on a bus through his hometown, and he thought about the memories he had about relationships, about places that he was fond of in that town. So it's very much a sentimental song about place memories and also relationship memories. Social imageability, as Dr. Misra mentioned, is a little different than Kevin Lynch's notion of physical imageability, which is how strong of a physical image do you get from an environment because it has, strong landmarks or it has a very clear path system. Social imageability has more to do with what Walter Fiery was talking about in his sociocultural school of human ecology. Remember, he made a big break with the human ecology school at Chicago and said, environments are not just about their economic dimensions and the biological analogy of people, being a population in a physical environment, a geographic environment, but they also have sociocultural meanings. So social imageability is all about the kinds of cultural and symbolic meanings that build up in certain places, and we get attached to those places or they have meaning for us because of those strong symbols. So this is the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., and it's a very simple design for a memorial, but it evokes extremely strong kind of reactions when people go there. They get very quiet, they get very contemplative. And so environments like that with those kind of strong meanings can bring out certain behaviors. You wouldn't go there to play Frisbee, for example, or you wouldn't set up your guitar there a juggler wouldn't set up there because the norms would be too strong to not do that in that environment. So social norms can really kind of dictate behavior based on how strong those images are. Now, another pathway that we talked about, so environments can reveal personality, they can influence our personality, places have personalities of their own, and there's a strong link between personality and health. There's a lot of research that's been done at sort of a healthy personality or why happiness is associated with longevity. There's a lot of research on optimism and happiness predicting longevity. So what is it about these different personality traits that enable us to stay healthy or stay healthy longer as compared to other personality traits? So we're going to talk about, some of those different dimensions. And in this list, you see several different personality concepts, sensation-seeking, sense of coherence, whether people have a coherent sense of their life and what's happening in it, psychological hardiness, which is a concept developed by Sal Maddie here at UCI, Professor Maddie in PSB, who, by the way, I had a course with when I was at the University of Chicago as an undergraduate. He was teaching there after he got out of grad school. So I first met him there and then had the fun of hiring him when he applied for a job here. Future time perspective, whether people see things as extended into the future or they're real present-oriented and they're just worrying about how to get through the next day, the next hour, as opposed to planning for college or planning for your future life stage. And people with more extended time perspectives tend to be healthier. They tend to have more of an optimistic sense of where their lives are going. Internal or external locus of control, whether people feel that events happen to them externally, external things just happen to them, or internally they're in control of their lives. They can affect what happens to them. That's the internals. Coronary prone behavior pattern. Anybody hear about that or anybody have a notion of what that is? Kevin's pointing out that there's a lot of medical research showing that when you compare people that have this hard-driving, somewhat hostile, time-urgent personality, they're much more prone to get heart attacks and cardiovascular disease than people that have the type B personality, which is more laid back. Somebody said in the song Analysis Chill, you don't get so worried about time pressures, you just let it roll off you. So that's the type A personality. And there's some research that's been done on the type C personality, the cancer-prone personality, although the evidence for that is less strong than it is on the cardiovascular side with type A. We know that anxiety, hostility are all associated with greater proneness toward disease. On the other hand, optimism, people that are optimistic tend to remain healthier for longer. So we're going to talk first about sensation seeking, and it's a very interesting concept, describing people's need for very strong, diverse sensations and experiences, willingness to take risks, and just to have that experience, not worrying so much about what's going to happen if you take the risk. And I'm going to read you some examples of the sensation-seeking scale, just so you get a flavor for what they're trying to get at. So people have paired choices, and you can pick A or B. So A would be, I like wild, uninhibited parties. B, I prefer quiet parties with good conversation. I often wish I could be a mountain climber. I can't understand people who risk their necks climbing mountains. I dislike all body odors. I like some of the earthy body smell, so that's response B. I get bored seeing the same old faces versus I like the comfortable familiarity of everyday friends. I dislike people who do or say things just to shock or upset others versus when you can predict almost everything a person will do and say, he or she must be a bore. And there's another pair that says the worst thing in life is to be rude versus the worst thing in life is to be a bore. So you kind of get the drift. You're discriminating between people that are sort of really high risk, high sensation versus those that aren't. And it turns out that this scale has a lot of predictive validity for various kinds of outcomes related to health and other behaviors. You know, this is some sample behaviors that somebody with a high sensation-seeking profile would engage in. You know, riding bikes on the edge of these cliffs here, or jumping off mountains in these wingsuits. And we're actually going to see an example of that in a video that Mark's going to play. Have any of you ever seen wingsuit jumpers? I mean, you've seen skydivers, but so you've seen them, okay. So we'll take a look at that. Or if you choose to be an astronaut, that would sort of pull for people that have a high need for stimulation and sensation. Somebody who is a low sensation seeker would not be in that profession. So you want to play before we go to that.
So we came here to Norway to jump off some of the biggest cliffs in the world. And in the past, we've always done ski-based jumps and kept our skis on and done really short delays. What we've always wanted to do is go off a terminal cliff. Terminal meaning you reach terminal velocity. So go off the cliff, do some flips or something, rip your skis off, and then fly away in a wingsuit. What we were doing last winter was the wingsuit ski base kind of stunt. But now we're here in the summertime with regular wingsuits to jump off some of the biggest cliffs in the world. We came over here specifically to learn how to fly our wingsuits off of cliffs and learn how to proximity fly and just learn as much as we can from these Norwegians and as much as we can from Loic.
At the beginning of wingsuit base jumping, we were trying to get as far from the wall as possible, so basically clearing out the whole thing, and now it's getting boring, so we play around.
I'll never forget that. I'll never forget seeing these guys that I've been watching in the base jumping movies, doing it in person, just buzzing the walls, like scraping their fingernails just about on ledges at 100 miles an hour.
How close to the road do you think you'll get? But here, hopefully.
Flying a wingsuit is kind of just how you would imagine flying. You know, if you've ever dreamt about flying, you just kind of probably dream of just soaring around, and you just kind of go wherever you look, and you keep your arms out and just do it. Probably one of the most impressive things on the trip was just seeing Espen fly that close to the ground, buzzing the road.
So how many of you would like to do that? Some of you are raising your hands. All right. So that's a pretty good behavioral view of what sensation seeking is all about. And we're going to talk about a couple of studies where sensation seeking was found to mediate the effects of stress or exposure to high levels of stimulation on people's health. This is one of those examples by Saracen, Ron Smith, Johnson, and Erwin Saracen at the University of Washington. So there were 75 college students, males and females, and they took a battery of different tests. So one test was on their sensation-seeking drive, and they split them into high and low sensation seekers. And then the other test they gave them was the stressful life events scale. So there are about 40 items that they came up with for this stressful life scale. And you can download these, by the way, from the website. We've got the perceived stress scale, the sensation-seeking scale. I don't think we have the stressful life event scale, but let me just read you some of these items. And they range from 100 points at the max to 11 points at the bottom. And if you score over 300 points, you're really going to be prone to getting sick. So there are things like death of a spouse, 100 points, divorce, 73 points, marital separation, 65 points, imprisonment, 63 points, death of a close family member, 63, marriage, 50. So even a happy event, getting married, it puts demand on people. You know, there's a lot of preparation, there's a lot of kind of anxiety, how's this going to go? And so you can see that there are a lot of different events, and some of the ones that are less stressful according to this scale are things like change in schools, change in residence, 20 points, taking out a minor mortgage or loan, 17 points, a vacation, 13 points, because after all, you got to get ready for that vacation. It's a little stressful when you come back. You're overloaded. A lot of email to catch up on. Minor violation of the law, you get a traffic ticket, 11 points. So you fill this out, 40 items, and then the researchers sum up your total life points. And that's a pretty good basis for predicting people's tendency to get sick. Now, subsequent studies found that it matters a lot on whether these events are perceived negatively by people or positively, because we have a mix of positive and negative events here. And if you're in a relationship that's really stressful for you, then getting out of it might actually be a relief and not a stressor. So getting back to Lazarus's notion of psychological stress, that really what is stressful for people is their perception of the event, if it's threatening. What they did in that study is they divided people into the negative life stress and the more positive life events. And anybody remember what they found for the sensation seekers in the negative life events condition? Who were the ones that were more prone to express distress on scales of negative symptoms and that type of thing? Yes. So Susan's saying that in the negative life stress condition, people that were really high on negative life stress, the low sensation seekers were quite different than the high sensation seekers. The low sensation seekers got sick or they expressed more negative symptoms than the high sensation seekers. What about for the positive life events? Was there any difference between sensation seekers? Well, basically, the sensation seekers and the low and high were the same for positive life events, but it was the negative ones where you saw that separation between the high and low sensation seekers. So it's an example of how this personality trait can really get in the middle between the environment and the outcomes and determine how somebody's going to respond in terms of their physical health and also their emotional health. And these are some of the items that I read to you, from death of a spouse down to minor violation of the law. And we won't go through them all, but you can look at those when you get the slides. Now, another interesting scale is this perceived stress scale that Shel Cohen at Carnegie Mellon developed. And he's the guy that did the study of colds. Susceptibility to colds is a function of high or low stress. When you go into the dorm, before you get shot up with that cold virus in your nose, he had people fill out his scale on whether they were stressed in their life for the past 4 weeks or not. And so he was measuring things like, in the last month, how often have you been upset because of something that happened unexpectedly, or you felt you're unable to control important things in your life, you felt nervous and stressed. Have you felt confident about your ability to handle personal items? So he mixed in some positive items as well as negative ones. How often have you felt that things were going your way or that you could not cope with the things that you had to do? How often did you feel like you were on top of things? or things where you were angry because things were outside your control, difficulties were piling up so high you could not overcome them. So these are the kinds of items that go into that perceived stress scale, the psychological stress feature. And what you see with that are when you have people that are really feeling it, cognitively and perceiving the stressor to be bad in their life, that's where they are more likely to get sick when they get exposed to a cold virus. So all of you are getting exposed to bugs all the time, but what compromises your immunity? And it could be a lot of things. It could be lack of sleep, it could be poor diet, but it also could be stress. And this study, or the study by Sheldon Cohen, where he experimentally exposed people to the viruses, showed that those in a high stress condition were much more likely to get the cold and more severe symptoms. Now, one more example, and then we're going to take a little break and then come back and finish up. Dr. Misra and I did a study, and in fact, a lot of this is based on her dissertation research. For her dissertation, she was looking at ways in which people use internet and digital technology. And we wound up doing a kind of distinction between cyber-based sources of stimulation, like you're getting a lot of emails, a lot of texts, a lot of faxes, you're trying to multitask. And so, these have to do with information and communication transactions that are mediated by technologies like the internet, cell phones, smartphones, laptops, PDAs. By the same token, you can talk about place-based sources of stress. So these are the kinds of things that you encounter in actual physical settings. They're not mediated through technology, but you go into this very crowded environment or traffic congested environment. I was on the Kennedy Expressway today in Chicago trying to get to my plane, which was leaving early in the morning so I could get to class today, and it was like wall-to-wall traffic. And then we're about to board, and I find out that they've got a mechanical problem, and they didn't know if they were going to take off. So I was almost ready to call Mark and Dr. Misra and say, uh-oh. But these are place-based kinds of sources of stimulation and stress. Being so tightly jammed together in this workplace here where you don't have a lot of privacy, you've got a lot of distraction. So these are stimulants that are not mediated by electronic devices, and they originate in sources such as social interactions and roles in physical settings. So one of the things that we were interested in knowing is how those different types of sources of overload affect people in their day-to-day lives, their health, their stress. Because when Stanley Milgram wrote his article on living in New York City, there was not very much attention to cyber-based sources of overload. Now, we're all trying to handle all this information and communication coming with us daily across several different channels and devices. So what the study found, and this is based on her dissertation, is that sensation-seeking moderated the relationship between both cyber-based sources of overload and reported stress, as well as place-based sources of overload and stress. And finally, when you put those two categories together and you give somebody a combined score for how much cyber and place-based stimulation they have, the higher their sensation-seeking level, the lower their reported stress. So if you're managing a lot of email and you're managing a lot of texting and digital transactions, if you are a high sensation seeker, you have a higher threshold for that or a higher tolerance for that. People that have that lower tolerance tend to give in to more stress or feel more overloaded by it. It's done in Israel on concentration camp survivors that had moved from Europe to Israel. And basically what Antonovsky was interested in, it was why did some of those immigrants that had gone through really tough experiences during World War II, why did some of them thrive once they got there and they developed new lives and they sort of picked up the pieces and went on, whereas others got sick and died sort of prematurely? And he found that as he studied the people that were able to cope better with all those stresses, that they were able to put meaning on what had happened in early parts of their lives and connect that to the more recent phases of their lives. So there was a kind of continuity or coherence, he called it. And people that just perceived it to be chaotic, random, terrible stuff and couldn't make that meaning out of it, and it was pretty challenging to make meaning out of severe events, those people were much more susceptible to getting sick and dying prematurely. So the sense of coherence really does relate to your kind of appraisal of the situation, what's going on, whether you see it as a challenge to learn from something terrible and improve or get better in the future, or whether it's, becomes so overwhelming for you that you sort of give into it. And we don't always have a lot of control over whether we can do one or the others, but sometimes we're wired a little differently that way. So that's the kind of personality trait he was trying to measure. Now, one other one is this notion of psychological hardiness, and this is developed by Sal Maddie here at UCI, and it's been used to predict a lot of health outcomes. And in fact, Maddie has developed a kind of training program to make people, or to encourage them to become hardier. And he has these 3 dimensions of hardiness. Can anybody kind of tell me a little bit about what each of those dimensions means? What does it mean to have high commitment in his model? Okay, so commitment, you can make things interesting. So rather than getting overwhelmed by boredom, you kind of make them, you see interest value in it, so that there's a reason you're doing this stuff and you're not just doing something that seems not valuable. Control is fairly obvious. It's whether people have a sense of efficacy that they can change what's going on in the world, or they're, powerless to do that. And challenge, what is challenge? And we just saw some pretty hefty challenges in the Antonovsky study of concentration camp survivors. So what would that refer to? Yeah. Can you take a negative event and see it as a challenge that can be overcome and that you can learn from something difficult? Or do you see it as something that's so difficult you can't possibly cope with it and it's going to do you in? And so that's what he means by challenge. So what he tried to do in his hardiness training is take people working at a large utility company in Chicago when he was living there, and these people were going through a lot of work stress. And he advertised that he was going to form some stress reduction training groups, and he invited people to sign up. And he basically had about 54 people in this sample, and he had them divided into groups of about 6 people in these different conditions. One condition was training people to develop more of a sense of commitment, control, and challenge. And he actually had, over the 10-week sessions, each session was about an hour and a half over 10 weeks. And in the different sessions, they learned how to reconstruct what's going on in their life, to frame it more positively or more as a challenge than as a setback that couldn't really be overcome. And he encouraged ways of trying to see meaning and interest value in things that were going on in their lives. So he actively trained people to do that. Anybody remember the other 2 comparison conditions he was trying to sort of control for or compare other approaches? Amber? In addition to hardiness training, Amber's saying one of the approaches was relaxation, meditation, muscle relaxation, and transcendental meditation, non-religious sort of meditation forms. So people were trained up on how to do that. Today we have these mindfulness classes here at UCI. You can sign up for them through the Samueli Institute and learn that technique. But that's kind of what he was trying to do there. And the 3rd condition was passive listening. People would come to the group, they'd share their troubles with each other, and they would sort of coach each other or give each other ideas and suggestions about how they might deal with the situation in somebody else's life. So there was social support there. And there was also a placebo effect in that he told the groups at the outset that each of these approaches, the passive listening and the meditation conditions, were going to help them. There was evidence that they would help them overcome stress. So they had a positive expectation going in. And then he tested them before and after this training course on their levels of stress, their levels of strain, job satisfaction, and also on their hardiness levels. So there's a scale that he and a guy named Paul Barone developed to measure psychological hardiness. So what he found is, first of all, that the hardiness condition here, when he measured their actual changes in hardiness over the pre and post, there was a greater gain here. Even though these groups were starting out higher, there was less of a gain, 75 to 77, 71 to 72. But here you have this bigger jump, or at least statistically significant gain in post-treatment hardiness. And he made the observation that sometimes when you compose these groups, you're going to get these selection differences where you might actually start out with people being hardier in this condition than in another condition. So he was relying on different scores between pre and post to see what the overall change was. And that's where he had this evidence that hardiness training actually increased hardiness more than the relaxation, meditation, or passive listening. So that was one of the tests he did. He looked at another outcome or dependent measure of strain, people's symptoms of strain. And this is analogous to Sheldon Cronin's perceived stress scale, but Maddie was using a slightly different scale to measure that. And here again, he found that hardiness training was more effective in reducing strain than were these other approaches, relaxation, meditation, and passive listening. And you can see that kind of reduction factor here being a little greater, 39 to 27 and 32 to 22, although that's a pretty good change there. And each of these conditions did change people in the sort of favorable direction toward less strain, but when they did the statistical test, it was more of that shift downward in the hardiness training groups. And finally, he looked at job satisfaction, and here again found that hardiness training was associated with larger increases in job satisfaction than the other two conditions. And you can see that up here in terms of these gains, 140 to 148 versus 146, 148 to 141, 146. You could say, well, those aren't very big differences, so why make too much out of it? What is going on there is statistical significance. So those are the general patterns that we found.